Welcome. In our lesson today, we are looking at IELTS speaking. What I hope to do is to give you some of the structure of the test and an understanding exactly at what the examiner is trying to achieve, in the hope that this will make you feel more comfortable and help you to feel more confident as you come in to the speaking test. Let's firstly have a look at the basics of the test before delving into some of the more complicated matters of assessment and also the structure of the test. We'll look at each part individually in subsequent lessons, but in this lesson, I just want to give you an overview as to what you should expect and also take you into the mind of the examiner. As an experienced assessor myself, I want to let you know what it is that the examiner is thinking as they give you a mark. So let's consider firstly just some of the basic questions related to the test. The test, surprisingly, is not very long. The question always comes up, how long is the test? The test should take you somewhere between 11 to 14 minutes, which really, when you consider it, is not a long period by any means. In that short amount of time, the assessor is able to give you a score and is able to assess your English because the test is split into three sections. Each one of those three sections targets a specific criteria, a specific skill set, and the test progressively gets more difficult to see how a candidate would cope within a variety of settings. Which brings us to the question of how are you actually marked in an IELTS test? Well, there are four criteria, and you're given a score of 1 to 9 across those four criteria. So for each criteria, you get an individual score. Unfortunately, IELTS doesn't give you the results for each criteria, neither for the speaking nor for the writing. So all you will get, in essence, is one score. However, it is important to bear in mind that the examiner is looking at four criteria and giving you an individual mark for each one. So let's have a look at the structure of the test. The test begins with an introduction followed by an interview. Now, when we think about the introduction, basically the examiner wants to get to know you. They want to make sure, firstly, that you are who you say you are, that you're not your twin brother or your twin sister. They want to check your ID and make sure that they know your name and that you are the person who is supposed to be there for the test at that particular time. Uh, in the first part, we've got 4 to 5 minutes just to basically warm you up, get you ready, get you speaking. All of these questions will be about you and very easy, which will bring us to the interview part of part one. Basic questions being asked by the examiner with short responses from the candidate. After part one concludes, we move into part two. Now, part two is the most intimidating part, in my view, because you're asked to give a monologue. Giving a monologue is like giving a speech in school. There's nobody there to support you or to help or assist or prod you along. And so, obviously, it's a little bit of a daunting experience. You've got 2 minutes for the monologue, but the whole of part two actually takes 3 to 4 minutes. After the monologue is complete, we move into part three, which is the discussion. The discussion also takes 4 to 5 minutes, as does the interview. And we call it a two-way discussion, but really it's not. It's just you discussing a topic and the examiner giving the prods or the questions in order to get you speaking. Now, when we are going through all of these sections, what are we actually getting tested on? Are we getting tested on our opinions? Are we getting tested on our political views? Or are we getting tested simply on our English? Now, while the first two would be items we wouldn't be getting tested on, while we say we're getting tested on our English, what part of our English are we actually being tested on? So there's 4 criteria that the examiner is looking at. The first being fluency and coherence. The second being lexical resource, followed by grammar, range and accuracy, and finally pronunciation. So remember, for each of these, you'll be getting an individual score, and it is possible that you could get a 7 for fluency and coherence, while at the same time getting a 5 for grammatical range and accuracy. So it is important that you are aware of each of these criteria and know how to adapt your speaking to match these criteria. Now, let's have a look firstly at fluency and coherence. Now, there's certain things that the examiner is looking for here. He's looking at talking at length, so being able to give long answers, not just simple, short yes and no answers. For fluency, you need to show that you actually can give a substantial answer to a question. Then, of course, we've got pauses, hesitations, especially inappropriate ones. If you're translating from whatever language to English, whether it be you're translating from Kazakh to English or Russian to English, what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of pauses and a lot of hesitations in your language. And obviously, that's going to make it difficult for somebody to concentrate and listen to you. And if you have a look at the criteria, you'll see that fluency and coherence will be affected to a band score 5. After the band score 5, we're looking at somebody who's a little bit more fluent, somebody who can speak a little bit at length, be it with some pauses or some repetition at times. We want to see somebody can talk without self-correction. Now, obviously, at each criteria, that looks different. However, generally, we're looking for somebody to be able to be understood. So we're looking for clarity. Can somebody speak in a way that they are being understood? And obviously, last but not least, the linking devices. Is it just sentences we're hearing, or is there some kind of linking devices being used which gives some structure to the talk? Basically, if we sum all of this up, you need to keep talking, but also at the same time make sense. To illustrate this, I've got a video. I've got a good discussion question here for our American friends. And the question here is, recent polls have shown 1 in 5 Americans can't locate the US on a world map. Why do you think this is? So this would be something of a typical question in a part 3, where you're asked to discuss a question, an idea, and give reasons for why you think the way you do. Now we're going to see a native speaker discuss this question. And I want to ask you, as you listen to her, can you understand her point? Is she clear? can you repeat what she said when she's finished speaking? Has she answered the question? So let's have a look at this video and ask ourselves these questions, and we'll be right back.
Okay. Recent polls have shown a fifth of Americans can't locate the U.S. on a world map. Why do you think this is?
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, like such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere like such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. Or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our children.
Thank you very much, South Carolina.
As we saw in the past video, friend, she wasn't very coherent. She was fluent. She was able to keep speaking, but I think she left the audience and the presenter very, very confused. So it's not just important that you can keep speaking, but that you can make yourself understood. And that's the meaning of coherency. Now, I would say that fluency and coherence is really the thing that you need to focus on in your speaking. It's the first criteria the examiner is looking at, and it's probably the most important one. Now, within the test, it's very difficult to adapt your lexical resource. Obviously, you either have it or you don't. The examiner will ask you on a range of topics for you to be able to demonstrate a range of words and paraphrasing. He's also looking out for things like collocations and less common vocabulary. But the key thing here is to make yourself understood. Don't use a word you're not really sure of because it might come across confusing. And if something does come across as confusing, obviously communication breaks down. So obviously we want to avoid errors. That's important. Another thing that IELTS teachers often really push is in band 7 we see uses some less common and idiomatic vocabulary, and they see this in the band descriptors and they think, great, we can really help our students to get this band 7. All they got to do is to learn some idioms. Now, idioms and idiomatic vocabulary, it's not quite the same, and I guess one thing that you really should avoid doing is learning some of these cliche idioms in the hope that you can get a band 7. Some of these idioms which are taught in books are quite outdated, nobody uses, and I guess what would be better to use is some of the more modern vocabulary, slang that is out there, and you can pick that up through watching movies and the likes. Following on from the vocabulary, another thing that is also important is grammar. Now, the examiner is going to be looking out at the structures that you're using. He's going to be looking at the range. Obviously, when you start learning English, you start with the basic tenses. You start with present simple, can, for ability. You start looking at the past tense and possibly the future tense. As you move up into pre-intermediate, you start to look at some of the perfect tenses, start to master those, and possibly some conditional clauses. As you move into the intermediate and upper intermediate, these tenses start to get more and more complex. And obviously, the IELTS also is expecting from somebody wanting a higher band score to be able to demonstrate some of those more complex grammar structures, which would be required in a upper intermediate or advanced English course. However, when you're there preparing for the IELTS test, obviously the thing within the speaking test that you really want to avoid is the examiner ending up looking like this girl. So what we want to avoid is confusing our listener. Remembering that it's not so much about grammar in your IELTS test. You shouldn't be sitting there in your speaking thinking, oh, what tense am I going to impress the examiner with? Really what we're trying to do is we're trying to communicate. It's a little bit late to be really thinking about grammar structures in the test. What we're focusing on is not confusing the examiner. And let me demonstrate that to you in the criteria. So we've got band 5, we've got band 6 and band 7 here. Snippets of it taken out from the criteria which the examiner is assessing you on. So we can see a band 5, there's going to be a limited range of complex structures. But the key thing is here that some comprehension problems will occur. So here within the structures, you might be confusing the examiner a little bit. He's going to award you a band 5. Now, a lot of us are really worried about mistakes. However, if we have a look at band 6, we can still get awarded a band 6, making frequent mistakes with complex structures. And mistakes are a natural part of learning. They're also a natural part of speech. We all make them. However, the difference here is how these errors impede comprehension. Do they stop the examiner from being able to understand what you're trying to communicate? And if we look at band 7, we can see that there's frequent error-free sentences. However, that also means that there are sentences with errors, and that's okay. You can still get a band 7 making errors, but there's no more comprehension problems. So if you're looking at a band 7, what we're really looking for here as examiners is that there's no communication breakdown, that your sentences are clear in terms of communication, but some grammatical errors may still persist. The last criteria that the examiner is looking at is pronunciation. In pronunciation, the really important thing is to be able to understand the candidate. So you want to make sure that the examiner can understand you, and the examiner is also looking for your ability to use some intonation, not just speak flat. And a big one here is accent. Now, everybody's so worried and so self-conscious about their accent for some reason. However, all of us have an accent, and it's not uncommon for native speakers not to understand each other, even if they live on one island. And I want us to watch a video. This happened in the UK Parliament, and have a look at how native speakers can sometimes find accents quite difficult.
Much, Mr. Speaker. I know from speaking to a number of parliamentary colleagues that there are still certain aspects of the estate, including the Northern Estate, that are not great for people with disabilities. Can I ask the honourable gentleman what work is being done to make sure that this place is more accessible, particularly for some of our colleagues who have a disability?
Here, here.
I'm sorry, it must be something to do with my Antipodean background. Could you please repeat the question, because I didn't follow it?
Well, very popular today. I'm saying that a number of parliamentary colleagues who have disabilities do find it quite difficult getting around certain parts of the state. Given that we're doing this refurbishment work, what can be done to make sure that those with a disability are able to move around more freely and the place is accessible?
I'm really sorry. Please, could you do it very slowly in Antipodean English? Thank you.
Just give me any old answer.
I think the answer might be helped if you can reply in writing when you're reading. Right, Chris? Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll try it on the first go.
Oh, no,
Can I? Because I'm Welsh, so God help him. So, can the honourable gentleman confirm that as part of...
So, as we saw, one Englishman in Parliament was unable to understand a Scottish Parliament member. It caused quite a bit of embarrassment. Now, obviously, accent can affect understanding, and it does happen, even among native speakers. However, don't worry about your accent. You don't get points for accent. You don't get a higher band score for one accent and a lower one for another. It all comes down to understanding. However, what is important is accurate word and sound pronunciation. So let's have a look at another video about pronunciation and have a look at these so-called teachers and how they teach regarding pronunciation.
G O G L E Gulu gulu
DAN GER OUS Dungers NATURE Nature FUTURE Future Nature Future.
Number one, tire, 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 pure, 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 scales, 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 huse, huse, hole, hole, fire, 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 fire. Number one, tire.
So as you can see, some of these, the pronunciation that these teachers were teaching was not very easily understood at all. So at the end of the day, if you want a band 9, all you have to do is fulfill this criteria. Is easy to understand throughout, with the L1 accent having minimal effect on intelligibility. So it's all about being understood. Not speaking fast, not speaking too slow. Having a normal pace. And speaking and pronouncing words in a way that is understood. That's brought us to the end of our lesson. So in the next lessons on speaking, we'll be looking more at how we should answer questions. What are some of the tips and tricks that we can use in order to get a higher score on our IELTS speaking?